all for coming, and I'm not going to talk to you about that rickshaw story. I'm actually quite bemused by it all. But since Gurdit is here, we have one of the all-time funniest rickshaw wala stories. Remember the one in Quetta? And this, they were asking us, "Aap shaadi shuda hain, wo aapki biwi hain, wo aapka shohar hain, vagera." So Gurdit, though he is now a very sharif diplomat, is also an expert pungabaz. And we had many pungas. And so one of my favorite pungas from Balochistan was, I said to the rickshaw wala, I said, "Oh janab, wo sirf mere ek shohar hai, lekin mere char hain. वो मेरे सबसे पसंदीदा शौहर हैं, तो वो मेरा सफर करने वाला शौहर है. एक और शौहर वो कपड़े बर्तन धोते हैं, एक और मेरी गाड़ी को ठीक करते हैं, एक और गार्डनिंग वगैरह करते हैं." So then he turns to Gurdit and he says, "Sahib," and if I'm mangling it, you have to give your version. He says, "Sahib, ye sach hai." And Gurdit says, "Bilkul sahi baat hai, bilkul ekdam sahi." So then we went on, because we were now in this punga groove. And I said, "Bhaijan," to the driver, "तो देखो, पाकिस्तान की आबादी कितनी बड़ी है. मसला ये है कि आप एक कितनी बीवी हैं, 4 3 हैं, तो आपके बच्चे बहुत ज्यादा हैं. मेरे 4 शोहर हैं और हमारे बच्चे बहुत कम हैं. तो वाज़ह तो है कि मेरे 4 शोहर बहुत ज्यादा कमाते हैं, हमारे 5 सैलरीज हैं, तो इसके लिए जी हमारे निजाम बहुत बेहतरीन है." And the poor fellow was so. Am I mangling the story? So we had so much fun with this fellow, and we never told them that Gurdit was not only not my husband, but that I didn't have 4 of them. The fellow was so horrified. And then there was another occasion. Remember the bicycle ride on Gurdit Singh Road? So Gurdit and I rode the bicycle and Gurdit sat on the back. I'm surprised. And this is the height of Taliban, right? This is 1995 in Quetta. I'm surprised no one shot us. Anyway, so those were some other tales of pungabazi with rickshawalas. From many years ago. But obviously we're not going to talk about that. So I'm going to talk about the Pakistan Army. And my preference in having these kinds of discussions is that I like having questions and answers. And so lots of opportunity for that kind of interaction. Because when I come to audiences like this, I never know how much people actually know about the Pakistan Army. And so I don't want to presume too low, and I don't want to presume too much. Also, if I use acronyms that you guys don't know, seriously just say, "What is that, lady?" Don't let me go on using acronyms that you don't know. Because I do live in D.C., and that is the second bhasha of D.C. is acronyms. So the book project really began when I was a baby analyst at the RAND Corporation. Because Gurdit and I, we actually started our PhDs on 6 studies. And so I didn't really become a terrorism or a political military expert by choice. It was actually by employment, because I was at the time employed by RAND. And so one of my first projects at RAND was looking at the Kargil crisis. And one of the things that really struck me was what seemed to be the irrationality of what Pakistan did during Kargil. Anyone that sort of thought this through, even a 14-year-old could have thought this through, that this was not going to redound to Pakistan's advantage. In fact, when I teach this to my South Asian class at Georgetown, I say if we were to make up a board game, like in my days when I was a kid it was Dungeons and Dragons, these youngsters now play Warcraft or whatever it is they play. But if we had such a game called India and Pakistan, right, and we had the objectives of the 2 countries, and we had the means that they used to prosecute those objectives, the 14-year-old that got stuck with the Pakistan hand would have folded up and gone home right away. Because it was so apparent, would be apparent to any 14-year-old, that Pakistan cannot achieve what it wants to achieve with the means at its disposal and using the strategies and tools that it's devised, right? So this is very simple. So you guys are Indian, I don't need to tell you this, but it's probably useful to make a few reprisals. The conventional wisdom is that Pakistan began supporting terrorism as a tool of foreign policy sometime during or immediately after the Soviet jihad. But for those of you who remember the 47-48 war, know that this is a bunch of bakwas. Pakistanis will typically characterize that war as one of non-state actors, that a bunch of Lashkars spontaneously ran up to Kashmir to seize the territory on behalf of Pakistan. Now, Shuja Nawaz, who is the brother of Asif Nawaz, wrote a very good article about this in India review. Unfortunately, it's firewalled, but if anyone wants it, email me. I've episodically made it available on Twitter. I mean, it's called The First Kashmir War Revisited. Now, no one can say that he is biased towards India. He is, after all, the brother of a deceased former army chief. And it was on the basis of that relationship that he was able to get access to Pakistan's army headquarters, and their archives. So mobilizing archival literature in this article, and he doesn't do such a good job of it in his subsequent book, he details the extent to which that tribal uprising was entirely supported by the provincial governments of what was then the NWFP, as well as the Punjab government, and obviously the military. All the logistics was provided by the military, and as you know, it eventually came to the point of the apex decision makers of the nascent Pakistan government itself. So Pakistan's first act of independence was using non-state actors. Now, I'm sure many of you know, they eventually became known as Mujahideen. So even the notion that they've used Mujahideen only recently is also very false. They've done this really from the first days of the state. So as Pakistan's strategy, and what is Pakistan trying to achieve? I argue in the book that we all know about its strategy in Kashmir, right? It seeks to use terrorism to coerce India to make some concession on Kashmir. But I am also of a very strong belief that Kashmir is symptomatic, it's not causal. Because and I'm going to detail this, in greater detail in a few minutes. I argue in the book that the Pakistan Army's demand for Kashmir, it's not based upon military considerations. Let me tell you what I mean by that. What would be an example of military considerations? Well, the current LOC is not defensible, right? Or maybe strategic positioning of the headwaters puts Pakistan at a disadvantage with respect to Indus water supply. These are strategic reasons, right? But when I went through years of Pakistan's defense literature, and what do I mean by years? I mean 6 decades, basically from the beginning of Pakistan's defense literature, not one argument did they ever make for getting Kashmir on strategic or military grounds. And I'm not exaggerating. When I say not one, I don't mean approximately not one. I literally mean not one. All of the arguments for Pakistan's claim to Kashmir rest on the two-nation theory, right? And so from their point of view, Kashmir is a fulfillment of the two-nation theory. But the two-nation theory is also a very pernicious argument because it basically sets up, as I argue in the book, India and Pakistan for civilizational conflict that has no resolution, right? What every Pakistan army chief has said, Raheel Sharif has not yet said it, but he's fruited about with this Kashmir is our Shahrukh. All of them pull up the Shahrukh literature, right, which is Kashmir is our jugular, which they should be careful because jugulars can be slit by a good covert operator. So they should be very careful. I'm sure Mr. Doval has probably managed a few Shahrukhs in his past. So their arguments, and I'm not advocating violence. That was a joke. I'm a pacifist. I don't advocate violence unless it's done by a drone. But their argument is really based ideologically. Every army chief, and I'm sure Raheel Sharif will say this, or at least if he has, it hasn't been reported, that any peace with India has to be on the terms of India's accepting the two-nation theory, and it has to accept Pakistan as an equal to India, right? So this is an absurd proposition. India can't accept the two-nation theory because the two-nation theory is antithetical to India's own sense of being a pluralistic secular democracy. And why would India accept Pakistan as India's equal when that is absolutely the most preposterous thing I've ever heard the ISI say, except they say a lot of preposterous things. So the way they set up this conflict is essentially interminable. And so going back to the essential query for the book, why would a country like Pakistan set itself up for a conflict in perpetuity that it cannot win when the tools that it has devised for itself, terrorism under an expanding nuclear umbrella, has actually imperiled the state itself? So in full disclosure, I'm not a political scientist, but I work with a lot of them. So I did my dissertation on South Asian languages and civilization. So I approach this puzzle. It's a political science question But the data that I bring to it are textual, right? So as I said, the primary empirical basis for this work is 6 decades of their own literature. So they've been very angry at what I've written in the book. Like, dudes, you wrote this stuff. So if anything, you should be asking yourself, why are we publishing this nonsense? So, it's really right from the SOMP's mouth in every possible case. So from a political science point of view, political scientists expect states to change their policies when they fail. And you would certainly expect them to change or abandon policies when they imperil the very danger of the state, that imperil the very viability of the state itself. Now, I'm not one of these people that thinks Pakistan is going to crumble and fall into the Arabian Sea. For some people, that would be a very nice solution. But actually, Pakistan is incredibly stable. I call it the most stable instability. It has a resilience I think people don't appreciate, and a lot of that resilience comes from what some people call civil society. Unfortunately, much of that civil society is not civil society. And I'm happy to talk about what I mean by that. Jamaat-E-Islami is an example of civil society. It just happens to not be civil. So Pakistan has this very resilient underbelly that makes it very unlikely to break up, for better or for worse. And you can see this in the way it handled the floods, right? 1/5 of the territory is underwater, yet none of the terrible things that people predicted would happen, and that's in part because of this resilience. So why doesn't Pakistan get rid of its revisionism, right? After all, it's fought 3 wars over Kashmir. It started all of them. It's won none of them. It's waged a vicious proxy war since '89, but it actually goes back before that. They had been doing lower levels of sabotage, which Praveen Swami has documented brilliantly in his book. I highly recommend his book to you. And then obviously, it was defeated in the 1971 war, right? So by just looking at the facts, how does Pakistan see itself as India's equal so that it can continue to prosecute a set of strategies that's very dangerous to Pakistan itself? So what do I mean by very dangerous to Pakistan itself? For those of you who know about different masliks or masalik of Islam, Pakistan has 5 interpretive traditions. 4 are Sunni, and then they use a catchphrase for Shia, and of course within Shia Islam there are also many divisions within it. Most of the militant groups operating in Pakistan itself are Deobandi. Now, for those of you who know about Deoband in India, that may seem very strange to you because Deoband in India doesn't espouse any of this nonsense, and it's very pro-state. Deobandism, as it morphed in Pakistan, is a very different critter. Their ulama will meet, but the Indian ulama have generally been very reticent in criticizing their brethren across the border for whatever reason. So when I talk about Deobandism and to an Indian audience, keep in mind I'm not talking about Deoband India and its development here. I'm talking about Deobandism as it has evolved and taken root in Pakistan. So these Deobandi militant groups, you will recognize them by name: the Afghan Taliban, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Sip-e-Saab Pakistan, Harkatul Jihad Islami, Harkatul Ansar, Harkatul Mujahideen, this whole alphabet soup of killers. These are all Deobandi. Lashkar-e-Taiba is not. Lashkar-e-Taiba is a different critter altogether. Happy to talk about that. That's the source of the book. That's the subject of the book I'm working on now. All of these groups that Pakistan has sponsored have given rise to the Pakistani Taliban. So if you read the Pakistani press, they will blame India, they'll blame the CIA, they'll blame Mossad, they'll blame McDonald's, they'll blame Walt Disney. But what they don't do is blame the ISI. And the ISI is where this blame should really be squarely parked because these are their illegitimate Haramzadeh Aulad. There would be no Pakistani Taliban had there been none of these other groups. And I'm happy to talk about how these different groups began to break away. If there's any interest in that, it's sort of an elaborate, it's sort of like a key party, to use a very gauche expression. But that's kind of how these fellows formed to form the TTP. So, and if we look at the data in this recent decade alone, and I have a paper on this on my website, christinefair.net, and it's free, you can download it, it's not firewalled, where I map the intensity of different kinds of violence that happens all over Pakistan. And you can see the tens of thousands of Pakistanis that have been killed by this violence in the last decade alone. And it is this organization that has infiltrated the army. It is this organization that has become very close to killing Musharraf when he was the army chief, as well as corps commanders and so forth. So I think by any definition, we can say that Pakistan's strategy of using these Islamist terrorists as a tool of foreign policy has backfired, yet it persists. So I began looking into the literature of why states are persistently revisionist. And let me tell you what I mean by revisionist. Revisionism in this sense means a desire to change the territorial status quo, which is what Pakistan wants to do, right? It wants to change maps through bloodshed. I mean, even if it got 1 millimeter of Kashmir, that's changing a map. But what I argue in the book, Pakistan's revisionism isn't just about Kashmir. And in fact, reducing Pakistan's behavior to Kashmir is actually incredibly dangerous. And let me explain to you why that is. When I went through this exercise of reading their literature, the first thing I learned is that Kashmir is sort of like a road bump. What Pakistan really wants to do is retard India's rise. And what I find very interesting about this discussion is that it begins in the 1970s, before even Subramaniam and certainly Raja Mohan start talking about India's rise in the international system. So Pakistan's security managers begin anticipating an ascendant India that's going to be an extra-regional and indeed global power. And in fact, one of the earliest people to see India in this vein was actually Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Most people think of the nuclear program as being the brainchild of the Pakistan Army. For those of you who know better, I apologize. For youngsters, I'm going to dilate upon this a little bit. It was as early as 1964 that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto began arguing to Ayub Khan that Pakistan must have a nuclear weapons program. And his reasons were actually not incorrect. The first thing he noted is that India had a jump start. India's nuclear program, civilian nuclear program, actually began under the British. And so many of the early scientists studied with Bohr. For those of you who were bored by the Bohr model of the atom in college, these were some of the mentors. My first career was a chemist, so I can't help the Bohr reference. And then, of course, even though India's institutions were still nascent, they existed. Pakistan had no such institutions. So that was the first thing that he noted. The second thing that he noted was the war between India and China, in which India was obviously defeated, as well as the Chinese nuclear test at Lop Nor of 1964. And it was, of course, that was part of the argument that India talks about when it talks about nuclear apartheid, that China just sort of slipped its test in before the NPT came into existence. So Zulfikar, putting together these three things, argued to Ayub Khan that we need to have a nuclear program and we need to jumpstart it fast. Because he knew as soon as the Chinese tested that the Indians would sooner or later, because of the threat from China, so Zulfikar may have been a madman, but he wasn't always wrong, would want to have a nuclear capability. Ayub Khan said to him, no, absolutely not. If we pursue a nuclear weapons program, we will alienate all of our Western allies. And he made this really striking quote. It's kind of illustrative of how Pakistan's military still thinks. He says if we need a nuclear weapon, we'll just get one off the shelf from one of our allies. You know, the idea that we can just get this crap from America. They'll give it to us. So it wasn't until after the loss of East Pakistan in the 71 war, when the army was completely demoralized, and of course Zulfikar Ali Bhutto came to power, that he was able to begin jump-starting this nuclear program. And in fact, as I'm sure you know, it was he that sent A.Q. Khan out, but he's not the only one. One of my favorites is Bashir. He set up two competitive institutions. One was obviously KRL, Khan Research Laboratory, but the other one was the PAAC. And Bashir was in charge of the PAAC. So let me just tell you a little bit about Bashir, because this is also, by the way, the guy who met bin Laden, who tried to convince bin Laden that Pakistan can help him get a nuclear weapon. Bin Laden was not impressed, by the way. And we're lucky this was the guy that saw bin Laden. Because this fellow, in his magnum opus called The Quantum Mechanics of the End of Days, he calculated the precise number of angels that can dance upon the head of a pin. He also calculated the precise number of angels that can dance on the head of a pin. he also calculated the precise temperature of hell. And it had a lot of significant digits, because for it to be accurate, it couldn't be a round number, right? So you have to have like 15 significant digits with that bar over the last digit. The other thing that he did, which I thought was just genius, remember, he was the head of the Pakistani Atomic Energy Commission. He argued that the world's energy crisis could be saved by harnessing the power of jinns. I'm not making this up. You can't make this stuff up, because you just can't. So this was the fellow that met Osama bin Laden. Thank God, alhamdulillah, that this was the clown that presented himself to Mullah Omar and bin Laden. So going back to the Zulfikar story, and by the way, if you really want to read a fabulous book, do read A.Q. Khan's book, Smoking Grass. Oh, wait a minute. It's not smoking grass. What's it called? Eating grass. Mera kasur hai. But when you read that book, hold it like this, because the nonsense will fall out. And so one of my favorite things about the A.Q. Khan book, and again, you can't make this up. It's like, they think we're just a bunch of buffoons. So Khan, in his book, Smoking Grass, Feroz Khan, he says, the West has maligned our program. They say that we got our program only by stealing and by espionage and by buying it from the Chinese and the North Koreans. Well, that's actually a pretty accurate description. How the countervailing evidence that he provides is that while everyone was focusing upon A.Q. Khan, he was actually in the Netherlands still stealing stuff. And remember Bashir, the fellow I just told you about, the charming, very clever Bashir? He describes how Bashir was in an Italian hotel room with a pencil copying designs for a reactor. I'm thinking you didn't have better things to do than trace it out with the pencil, but there you have it. That was the evidence that Pakistan did not get its program through theft, espionage, deception, and buying it from the Chinese and the North Koreans. But anyways, so Zulfikar begins this, and then obviously when the coup happens, the army takes it over. So the point that I want to make about Pakistan's nuclear program is a couple. Most people think that Pakistan became nuclearized circa 1990. And this number has become lore, but most people don't know why we use this number. This was actually the number that came from the U.S. imposition of the Pressor Amendment sanction. Now, I'm going to discuss that in a second, but what I want you to know is that Pakistan actually had a nuclear weapon as early as 1980, sometime between 1980 and 1984. And going back to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, he writes in his biography, his autobiography, If I'm Assassinated, and of course he was assassinated, he actually describes how he did everything in his power to basically deliver Pakistan to the threshold of being a breakout state before he's assassinated. And I think when he wrote that book, many people thought it was exaggeration. But we now know that, in fact, it wasn't. Even Feroz Khan, in his book, Smoking Grass, confirms that this was the date, as have other officials from different governments. So Pakistan, and you can see this in their defense writing. Why am I going through this? Going back to my point that many people think of Pakistan behaving as a nuclearized state only in 1990, when I look at Pakistan's behavior, and in the book, I despite the fact that my PhD is in the humanities, I actually do number crunching, and I show this empirically using the correlates of war data, and I tie it to Pakistan's own defense literature. It begins thinking of itself as a nuclear-capable state as early as the late 70s, early 1980s. And there's this fabulous article that I quote where they say once we open up this, once we have this capability, we can renegotiate the Kashmir issue on our terms. And the way they describe this capability is quite interesting. It's not what they have or what they don't have. It's what India and the rest of the world thinks they may have. So in other words, this is what political scientists talk about as nuclear overhang or existential deterrent. So in other words, when we think about deterrence, what India has to think about is not what Pakistan has, but what it may have. What it may have. And so this question of ambiguity becomes one of its key tools. Because if you know what Pakistan has, and you can deduce its red lines, you can adjust your tactics and your strategy to punish them without crossing that red line. But if you're uncertain about what they have, and under what conditions they may use what they have, then you have to be much more risk acceptant because there's so much more uncertainty. So throughout the 1980s, they're banking on this uncertainty. And they continue to do this throughout the 1990s up until India tests. So India's nuclear test is kind of like a double-edged sword for India, right? Because what India's test does, it allows the world to begin seeing India in a different light. It begins this conversation with Strobe Talbot in the United States. The United States begins seeing India as a strategic partner, and we completely change the way we see India's possession of nuclear weapons. We now see it as an asset instead of a threat. That never would have happened had India not tested. The downside of that is that Pakistan tested, right? And now Pakistan is a confirmed nuclear menace, not just a suspected nuclear menace. So this expands Pakistan's capabilities. So what I do in the book is I map out two different kinds of trajectories. One is the empirics, where I look at Pakistan's use of violence, not only the kind of violence, but where this violence is happening. As Pakistan's nuclear umbrella begins to unfurl, Pakistan is no longer just operating in Kashmir. It's beginning to move well into India's heartland. So in the 1980s, you see, and the Pakistanis, they're extraordinary at waging insurgency. Because in the 1980s, they're active in the Sikh insurgency, right? They're completely active in Afghanistan. They're still, mucking about in the northeast, and they're still at a lower level, but then it escalates in Kashmir. That's actually an extraordinary level of juggling that the Pakistan military is engaging in. And of course, they're doing this under the unwatchful eye of the U.S. government. So let me tell you very briefly about the Pressor Moment. This is something that I spent a lot of time talking to my American colleagues about. I just wrote this piece. It was kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it really wasn't. That sort of explains how is it that the Pakistanis perennially take us for a ride, right? So if you were to look at, since 2011, we've given them $30 billion. And when I do the inventory, and oh, by the way, look at the weapon system that they've got, right? They've got something like 24 F-16s because the Pak Taliban have an air force. They also have anti-aircraft missiles, again, because the Pak Taliban have an air force. We gave them a Perry-class frigate for the Pakistan Taliban Navy. And we gave them a bunch of ground mobility equipment because obviously the Pak Taliban have a robust ground capability as well. So I encourage you to take a look at that list and just sort of scratch your head. What are the Americans thinking? I'm going to tell you what the Americans are thinking. The first thing you have to understand is that Pressor Amendment wasn't actually passed to harm the Pakistanis. This is a grotesque misinterpretation of that legislation that the Pakistanis themselves have advanced. And because unfortunately, and I write about this, how the Pakistanis beguile Americans. I mean, it's a real problem that we have in our system. We have South Asia experts, but we don't have South Asia cadre. And our institutional memory is terrible. So we have a very bad ability to understand what we did or didn't do. And I use the analogy of the goldfish swimming around that doesn't recognize its own couch. Oh, that's a new couch. That's a new couch. We do this, consistently. And it's not just with Pakistan, but it's a problem because Pakistan itself is so problematic. But actually, what had happened is I told you the story about Pakistan's nuclear umbrella unfurling much earlier than expected. By the way, the CIA did know this. This wasn't unknown to them. But what began to happen is that in 1979, President Carter, by the way, this was in April of 79, it's a very important date, President Carter actually, for the first time, applied Glenn Symington sanctions to Pakistan for advances in its nuclear proliferation program. April of 79. Why is that an important date? What happens in December of 79? Well, but the real issue for this is the Afghan crisis, right? The Soviet invasion. And what do Pakistanis say? Pakistanis say, you lured us into your jihad. We were the condom that you used to screw Afghanistan. They say this. I kid you not. This is a quote from ISI Wallace for many years. So this narrative is empirically false, right? Because if we had such a sazish to rope them into our jihad, why would we sanction them in April of 1979 when anyone with a clue saw that Afghanistan was melting down? The fact is we weren't because of what you noted. The Iranian Revolution had already begun, and we were completely taken off balance by that. And so we weren't paying attention to Afghanistan. what is very necessary for you to understand, that going back to the Afghan jihad, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto began organizing the ISI Afghan cell in 1974, right? Before any American even cared about Afghanistan, they were already organizing this jihad. And why were they doing this? Because Daud had just thrown out Zahir Shah. And Daud began a series of modernizing reforms that principally involved Islam and land reform. Two things that are going to really tick off people that own a lot of property, and that's going to be shrine holders, madrasa owners, and mosque administrators, right? Because when you talk about land reform, you're also talking about their huge holdings of land. So it's not cool to say, to mobilize because you're losing your land. It's much more effective to make this mobilization in the guise of Islam. And then these had social dimensions about veiling and so forth. This became a very emotive way of mobilizing Afghanistan's Islamists. By the way, how did Afghanistan get its Islamists? People don't know this either. Pakistan began supporting Jamaat-E-Islami in Pakistan as early as the 1950s. For anyone who knows, Afghanistan has traditionally been Naqshbandi. So going back to my point about Pakistan engaging in these proxies from the earliest days of its state, it has, and it also did so in Afghanistan. Reason for that is Afghanistan didn't accept Pakistan's admissions to the UN. Afghan troops, although Afghans will say they weren't real troops, they didn't do it with authority. It was an unauthorized action, actually invaded Bajor. So when Daud does this, the Islamists rebel. Daud responds very aggressively. Where do the Islamists go? They go to Pakistan. And then the Shia primarily went to Iran. Zulfikar, who was very anxious to get the Durand Line resolved, said, fine, ISI, take all of these rabble-rousers and make them into effective militias. So by the time the Soviets crossed the Amu Darya, the 7 donkeys, as they came known, were already formed, and Pakistan did this on its own dime. So going back to the nuclear story, intermingling with Pakistan's use of jihadis, this is an important narrative. Why? We had sanctioned them in April of '79. But as things began to melt down in Afghanistan during the summer, the Carter administration realized, under Brzezinski, that we would have to let go of our non-proliferation commitments to work with Pakistan. And Carter relented, and he offered Zia a package which he denounced as peanuts, which was interesting for historians because Carter was a peanut farmer, and no one knows if Zia did that deliberately to take a punga or whether it was just ittifaq, but nonetheless he denounced it as peanuts because he knew that the Republicans were going to win. And he just waited out Carter. So going back to this tick, tick, tick of jihad and the nuclear weapons program, Reagan comes in the 1980 elections. He takes office in January of '81. He cannot get weapons to Pakistan. He cannot get money to Pakistan because of those sanctions. And he has to go to Congress to get those sanctions. So if you look at this, and there's data on this, money does not start flowing to Pakistan until 1983, and it peaks in 1984. Remember? And then 1989, the Geneva Accords are signed. So this Pakistani narrative that the evil Americans, and by the way, I'm going to concede that we are often evil. I'm not one of these people that, my jingoism is not to defend my country. My jingoism is to criticize my country when it does bad things. Right? That's what a patriot does. When our country screws up, we say, hey, dudes, you got to fix this, right? It's not defending every piece of nonsense that your country does. In my view, that's not patriotism. So I'm not going to defend this. But I'm going to tell you empirically, this wasn't our idea. However, Zia did not want, at this point, Zulfikar is gone and Zia is in power. Zia did not want to wage this conflict in Afghanistan as an ethno-nationalist insurgency. And he was very clear this had to be waged as an Islamist insurgency in the name of jihad. And the reason, as I'm sure many of you know, is that at partition and before partition, many Pashtuns did not want to join Pakistan. In fact, some of them even wanted to join India. And some of them instead wanted to have a larger Pashtunistan or Pakhtunistan, depending on which side of the Durand Line you reside, and not be a part of Pakistan at all. And so for many Pakistanis, they are viewed as sort of a dubious third column. And so what they didn't want to have happen is that Pashtuns would be galvanized in terms of ethno-nationalism. They wanted Islamism to be the discourse of liberation. And we went along with it, and then you see all these fabulous pictures with the different so-called Mujahideen commanders hanging out with Reagan, being feted in D.C., and what I think was one of the biggest strategic blunders of my country's history. But that's a different issue. So the money doesn't start flowing until 83, 84. But what's happening inside the United States is that we begin to have bureaucratic arguments. On the one hand, you have folks in the CIA who are saying, hey, dudes, they're getting the bomb. They may even have the bomb. And we're still funding these guys. So we're kind of subsidizing their bomb program. So maybe we need to cut this funding off. And then you had the people that were more interested in the covert operations in Afghanistan saying, sorry, dudes, nuclear stuff is going to have to wait because we have some Soviets to kill. And this debate is playing out throughout all of our institutions. And it's also playing out in Congress itself. And it comes time to renew those waivers that I told you about. And Congress says, no, we think Pakistan's proliferating. They may even have the bomb, and we're not going to keep writing the check. And they were correct, by the way. We now know they had the bomb by the time the Pressor Amendment even gets negotiated. Here's another thing. Pressler wasn't initiated by Pressler. It was actually initiated by Lugar, who was actually a Hoosier like me. Pressler was a junior senator, didn't know much, and they just basically said, hey, Pressler, run with this steaming pile of whatever. For those of you who know zoology, I believe the correct word is hatti ki lead. Sorry, I couldn't resist that because a gober just wasn't big enough for what the Pressor Amendment was and what it did. So essentially what the Pressor Amendment was literally a gentleman's agreement because there weren't that many or any women involved that said, Pakistan, as long as you don't test or do something that confirms you have a bomb, and our president certifies you have no bomb, we can keep giving you security assistance. So in other words, this wasn't a punitive piece of legislation. We passed it to allow us to continue fighting this thing in Afghanistan with full knowledge that they were proliferating. And in fact, the Pakistani Ministry of Foreign Affairs was explicitly involved in this, and they considered this to be, in fact, a victory. So this is, one of these things of history that we can debate. So when I wrap up my talk, I'm going to tell you some of the ways forward. I'm actually a big believer in really cutting off most forms of assistance to Pakistan and even considering sanctions. We have many sanctions on the book, by the way. All of our aid right now is going to Pakistan under a waiver of sanctions. So what's the point of having these laws on our book if we find ways of arming them anyway? What it does is it decreases the credibility of any threat we may have, right? If you're Pakistan, why would you take our threat seriously? Because for 11 years they've been taking our money, killing our troops, and we say, how much, sir? How much, sir? Kitna aapko kitna chahiye? And we keep writing the damn check. So that's another tirade. But going back to this, by the time we were out of Afghanistan, and the president was no longer willing to perjure himself to say that Pakistan had no bomb, Pakistan already had a bomb. So people who say that sanctions don't work and they cite the nuclear test of 1998 are foolish. How could the sanctions work when they already had the bomb? So I want you to hang on to that piece of information because that's one of the key criticisms that I get when I advocate cutting them off. They will say, cutting them off in 1990, look what happened. I'm like, well, you misunderstand the events of 1990. So going back then to how does Pakistan continue to use nuclear weapons as an umbrella while also using jihadis? Why does it do what it does, even though it's bearing such a huge cost? The first thing I want to point out to you is that it actually works. I hate to say this in India. How many terrorist attacks have you had in recent years that have had a clear postage mark that said Rawalpindi, Abpara, Muridke? And what has India done? It's really done nothing, right? The other thing I want you to think about is that it's cheap. It's incredibly cheap. So the estimates on how much it costs to run Lashkar-e-Taiba a year are about $100 million. Pakistan has a $7 billion defense budget. And by the way, that budget's deceptive because what they did to be in IMF compliance, they removed retirement benefits and other sort of non-pointy part of the sphere to another part of the budget. And then, of course, their nuclear stuff is not revealed in the budget at all. So an underestimate, the disclosed defense budget is over $7 billion. So $100 million is what? It's a drop in a terrorist bucket. The second thing is, most of these terrorist groups, let's say they have 10 of these things. You can do the math. This is incredibly cheap. And no matter how good India's internal security arrangements are, and I'm not going to comment upon them, you know them better than I, you cannot stop every single one of these terrorists. And every time there's an attack here, and by the way, you just saw this, that Washington, is that Washington Post correspondent Annie Gowan here? Yeah, so she wrote this horrible piece that whenever there's some flare between India and Pakistan, India has to do something to appease Pakistan. It's India's job to make Pakistan feel better, right? So in imposing this false equivalence, what she and everyone else purporting this canard have done is they've rewarded Pakistan, right? What does Pakistan seek to do with these shenanigans? To continue to have people saying Kashmir is the most dangerous place on earth, therefore we have to resolve it. What does resolving Kashmir mean in Pakistani parlance? It means conceding to them. It means make a concession on the basis of terrorism. Now, I've also been very clear, there's an instrument of accession. I think Pakistan just needs to shut up and we need to ignore Pakistan. But most of the world's not me. So every time there's a bomb blast here, and there's even a whiff of Pakistani involvement, the whole issue of Kashmir comes up. It's the most dangerous place in the world. 2 nuclear-armed adversaries are about to go to war. We have to fix it now, Merca. And what we've essentially done is we've given Pakistani a reward. Right? So this is incredibly cheap. It's incredibly effective, and it gets what it wants. But then here's the other side. So basically, from a point of view of benefit, it's very apparent why it does what it does. It works, and it's cheap, and there's nothing India can do to stop it. And India cannot make its own position validated in the international community because Pakistan's narrative about Kashmir as a dispute dominates, right? This is a fact. You know this more than I do. Okay, fine. We see the benefit, but why doesn't Pakistan see the cost, right? So this is actually the key, because benefits are clear. But in any cost-benefit analysis that's sensible, the benefits have to outweigh the costs. So Pakistan has a very elaborate strategy of managing the costs. And incidentally, its way of managing the costs has everything to do with how scary it is. So let's first of all talk about my country in the IMF. Ironically, Pakistan's negotiating strategy is, stop me before I shoot myself. And my response is, please, gole marne do, and just fix the problem. But unfortunately, that's not how most people respond. Most people say, oh my goodness, an aside. The other thing that they do is that they domestically, and there's no nice way of putting it, they sustain a very complicated set of lies to Pakistanis. Seeing it is believing it. You have to go there and talk to people, or just read the nonsense they write. But you might say, well, this is what they write. They don't really believe it. But I actually taught at LUMS in the summer of 2010. So LUMS is like the Harvard of Pakistan. It's not Harvard, but it's the best thing that Pakistan has. These are Pakistan's best students. Would you believe that they do not learn that they fought a war in 1947? I was very surprised. And because textbooks are a state subject, I went around and I asked all my students from different parts of Pakistan, did you learn this in Balochistan, Sindh? They never learned they had a war in 47, 48. And I was very lucky that I had put Shuja Nawaz's piece on the syllabus, because if I had put Shamik Ganguly or Ashley Tellis on the syllabus, they would have dismissed it as a Hindu sazish. But they couldn't dismiss it as a sazish because it's Asif Nawaz's brother who's writing this. So that was one of those, alhamdulillah, I put Shuja Nawaz on the syllabus and not Shamik Ganguly. But, and for them, it was an eye-opener that their country had fought a war in 40. So I asked these students, how do you think you have this conflict with India if you didn't have a war? I mean, have you ever thought this through? And the students hadn't. I mean, to me, it was real. It's like going through my education and not learning that we had the War of Independence or a civil war. I mean, it's just that foundational, and they didn't learn it. The other thing that they learn is they have won every war. Every single war, except 1971, which is obviously not something that they can say they won without a lot of contortions. But they do contort it. Because what they say is, yes, we did not win in 71, we lost half of our country. But India was a bigger army, and even though we've lost half of our country, India still has not defeated us. And actually, this is a key to understanding them. John Gare Karamat explained this to me when I was a butchie doing the Cargill project. And the import of it didn't really sink in until I began reading decades of their stuff. He said, defeat for us is doing nothing. Defeat for us is acquiescing to India. So we will always take a calculated risk with full knowledge that it may not pan out. So for Pakistan, simply not being decisively defeated is tantamount to victory. Being able to get up and take another punga is victory. And that's a really, and when he first explained it to me, I don't think I appreciated the gravity until I began reading these things. But this is this is how they describe the 1971 war. Look, we're the only country in the region that can stand up to India. Now, Pakistan doesn't really stand up to India, but in its literature, it does. And anyone who watches Pakistani TV will know that it does. So this is the first thing. And by the way, this isn't just in their curriculum. It is in Pakistani military publications. Surely you would think these Faujis know that they didn't win a war. But this is part of making a false discourse, right? They study this stuff. They repeat it amongst themselves. There's probably an elite sort of maestro who knows the truth. But the most important thing is that amongst the ranks in the junior officer corps, that these false histories are imbibed. It's also important that Pakistanis believe this, because if they believed otherwise, why would they continue to send their sons, and increasingly a few daughters, to continue to fight an adversary that it can't defeat? And so this is where Islam plays a really interesting role in Pakistan's literature. Many years ago, I wrote this piece when I was at the Rund Corporation. That was a joke. I said that word on purpose. The urban battlefields of South Asia, or some such. And the project looked at Sri Lankan, Pakistani, and Indian defense journals to see how they talk about doing urban operations. And what I learned from the Pakistani journals is they were really useless. It was amazing to me how they would spend so much space but never talk about an actual operation. And if you look at Indian defense journals, they're all about lessons learned, looking at previous wars, looking at previous tactics, doctrine, etc. Pak military journals don't do this. In fact, what I saw over and over and over were things like the role of Islami tarbiyat in training a junior officer, the role of jihad in training the officer corps. Now, after 9/11, many of my American colleagues saw some of these articles and they freaked out. Oh my God, it's a jihadi army. Well, in some sense it is. But that's not how those tropes were being used. And so it's important to understand both how they use Islam, but then also the problems of how they use Islam. So in their defense literature, as I said, India started every war. They believe this, and this is true in their curriculum, and Pakistan's. And by the way, Yom-e-Shahadat, I love that particular holiday, because that's the day that they celebrate that they protected themselves against the Indian aggression. I just love, that's why every country makes up holidays. So Pakistan, they just have a few more interesting ones. So in their literature, India starts every war. Therefore, every Pakistani response is a defensive jihad. And this is an important theological point that they make, because Muslims believe in defensive jihad in Pakistan. So the idea that this is an offensive operation would be very offensive to many Pakistanis. So in sustaining that willingness to keep fighting, they have to sustain they are the victim. And so there's this and you see this in everything that they say, this very strong victim undercurrent, but there's a rationale for that, because in their literature, every war is a defensive jihad. They also talk about, and this has a lot of salience with the way in which they use jihadis, they also talk about how every Pakistani should be able to wage jihad in defense of the state. So they begin talking about People's Army, by the way, going back to the 1950s. This isn't anything new. So this is the ways in which, and by the way, what I said by 1950s, I want you to understand the importance of that. This did not begin with Zia. this began with Ayub. Ayub gets no credit, or shame, I guess I should say, for what he did to the Army Officer Corps, even though the evidence for this is abundant. In 1954, he writes a piece on foreign affairs called The Ideology of Pakistan. Now, obviously, he didn't write it, but he just comes right out of the box talking about Iqbal. And in his book, Friends Not Masters, there are an entire chapter on the ideology of Pakistan. Now, his instrumentalization of Islam was different from that of Yahya and Zia's, but he was the one that embraced this idea that it's the job of the army to not only protect Pakistan's territorial frontiers, but also its ideological frontiers. And the evidence for this is abundant. There's no debate in my book, but people usually attribute this to Zia. So it's unfortunate for me to say, as I go through their literature and the way in which they set up this conflict and the terms for which they set up its resolution, all these Aman ki Asha walas are going to have a lot of Asha. There's not going to be any Aman. There's going to be a lot of boondoggles, for those of you who got that Punjabi pun, going off to exotic places like Thailand and all these beach resorts paid for by Ford Foundation or whoever. But that's all you're going to get out of these boondoggles. It's just boondoggles. Because whether we like it or not, it doesn't matter what the ordinary Pakistani citizen thinks. And by the way, I've done a lot of survey work on what the ordinary Pakistani citizen thinks. You shouldn't be putting your hope on the ordinary Pakistani citizen either, because they're actually not so nice about India. Yes, they may hate you less than us, but we'll eventually go away, and then they've got you to hate again. So these Aman ki Asha folks are barking up the wrong tree. What you really, and what my country really needs to do is understand that this problem isn't going away. Let's just pretend that the political military affairs ferry came down and made Pakistan a robust democracy in which the army was subservient to the civilians. Let's just pretend that. I know it's hard. It might take some liquor. Sorry for the teetotalers, a samosa or two or a lassi. But let's just pretend that this has actually happened. What makes you think these civilians are any better? The Bhuttos, Silsila, have talked about the 1,000 Years' War. Did you see the video of poor Bilawal trying to speak in Punjabi? Google it. He says, we will take back every part of Kashmir. It's like, first of all, it was never yours to begin with, so good luck with that. That's just, bad facts. But why is Bilawal speaking in Punjabi? This fellow can barely speak in Urdu or Sindhi. I've met the fellow. Why is he speaking in Punjabi? Who's his audience? The Faljis, right? So, and what about Nawaz Sharif? How can we take Nawaz Sharif seriously? Yeah, he's a businessman. What Nawaz Sharif wants is economic normalization with India. He's a Kashmiri himself. You think he's going to give up on 1 femtometer of the Falji fantasy? Of course he's not. And if you look at who his domestic allies are within the Punjab, his government is giving subsidies to Mareed K. Do you guys know this? It's a part of the Punjab flipping government. Since 2009, they are a part of the official Punjab provincial budget, right? And so you think that Nawaz Sharif is really, an Amma Kiyasha? No, he's not. So what I want you to understand is that there is no hope for Pakistan giving this up. And I'm going to go back to the ideological argument that I made. If Pakistan gives up Kashmir, what it has to, in effect, do is give up the two-nation theory, right? If it gives up the two-nation theory, what makes Pakistan different from India? It's just a lousy version of India, right? So there's no incentive, and we can either go through an ideological argument and we arrive at this point. We can also make a materialist point, a materialist argument, and arrive at the same point. What would be the logic of the Pakistan army continuing to interfere in Pakistan's domestic affairs if there was no Indian threat? Why would it continue to have a large conventional army that has the prerogative of taking over the country whenever it wants if it had a normal relationship with India? Right? Why would it have a whole separate womb-to-tomb system only for Faljis, folks in the Air Force, the Fazaya and the Bahariya, although those are the 3rd and 4th services of 3. So they definitely get the leftovers. So there is no ideological or institutional incentive for this country to behave differently. So what I've been arguing, and I'm not an Indian, so it's not my place. That's for you to argue. But let me tell you what I think my government needs to do, and we need to do it now, because every check we keep writing, the place gets more scarier, and that's how they coerce more money out of us, right? So every check we keep writing, we incentivize, reward, and subsidize the very tools that make them so horrible, and actually foster those very behaviors that we actually seek to mitigate. So this is, in terms of a public policy puzzle, a problem from hell. I'm going to argue, I'm not going to say cut them off, bomb, I'm not going to go there. But I am going to say, I'm not going to say cut and run. I'm going to instead say sever and saunter. What does sever and saunter look like? Well, sever and saunter looks like this. No more of these strategic weapon systems that they've been getting. I don't care that they're buying it from their own national funds, because they have no national funds. Those are my funds being laundered through the IMF or through bilateral. That's me. That's my goddamn F-16. Right? This is my funds. It's not their national funds. Why are we giving them strategic tools when we don't share strategic objectives? And in fact, it's the only state in the region that actively undermines even Iran supports more of our strategic objectives in the region than Pakistan does, right? So none of this needs to stop. So in other words, I'm kind of pushing towards a notion of containment, right? So what about this idea of transformation? Americans love to transform. This has been the heart of our post-9/11 engagement with Pakistan, is that with the right amount of aid and F-16s, we can transform them, we can induce them to be a reasonable country. Well, despite all of the evidence to the contrary, we continue to think this way. Well, there's a problem with our aid, right? And that is that when Richard Holbrooke was still alive, he said in congressional testimony that I was on the second panel to that hearing, that 90 cents of every one of our dollars allocated comes right back to the U.S. in terms of contractors, right? Because USAID, they're not out there, building schools, digging ditches. What they are really is they're a booking agency, right? They hire institutional contractors who then have contractors and have contractors, and the outcome is measuring the allocation and the execution of the funding, not the actual outcome of the program, right? So this is pork politics. So we can't actually have these kinds of things, and we're going to be expecting change. And also, I would argue that we foster corruption. I mean, this has been the big story in Afghanistan. Happy to talk about that. Just Cigar, which is this special investigator for the reconstruction in Afghanistan, every week has a horror story about how hundreds of millions of U.S. dollars has been squandered away in some sort of fiasco after another. So I'm actually very cynical about our U.S. aid program as we execute it. I don't think we give it to the right people. I don't think our goals are correct. I don't think our model is very appropriate. And I also don't think we do enough empirics. And it's also based on the wrong presumptions. I mean, this is another aside. I've done a lot of survey work. I'm not going to talk about India and the Naxalites. I'm going to talk only about Pakistan. The people that are terrorists and the people who support them are not poor. In fact, those who are the biggest supporters of terrorists tend to be well-educated, and they tend to be wealthier. I'm not going to say that this applies to other places, but this is true of Pakistan, and yet much of our aid is predicated upon this canard. So I'm also an advocate of seriously rethinking this big aid program that we have in Pakistan. But let me be very blunt, though. We probably know how useless our aid is, but when you have aid, you also have Jsocs, right? And that's part of the problem, is that we want to be able to have these Jsocs so that we can keep an eye on all these things that Pakistan does that are so scary. Third, and I sound a lot like a hawk, but I don't care, because I guess I am when it comes to Pakistan, we need to be much more aggressive in punishing official and unofficial individuals with whom we have intelligence, not evidence, I said intelligence, that they are supporting terrorism. We should be much more aggressive in visa denial. They deny us all the time. They deny our diplomats visas, right? So why do these Faujis, after killing our soldiers, when they have a heart attack from eating all that halim in Nihari, why do they have a presumed right to come to Harvard University and get, I don't know, a pig valve installed? By the way, that's a really interesting point of ijtihad. What do you do when you need a pig valve in your heart? Anyway, we need to be much more aggressive about these visa issues. And we need to go after their assets. Department of Treasury needs to be much more aggressive. These fellows don't just hold their money in Pakistan, right? They put their money all over the place. They have land. The Faujis and the ISI wallahs and the terrorist masterminds, they all have plan Bs, right? They have homes all over the place. And we need to be very aggressive in going after them. And finally, if you don't think I'm hawkish enough, I am. I'm a big fan of Jsoc targeting. What is Jsoc targeting? These are the snake eaters that go and kill terrorists, right? So we can't necessarily do any, and by the way, Ajit Doval, if you're listening, I'm a big fan of Jsoc targeting. We do this. This is what we do. We put people on a list, and we dispense with them. Now, we may not, because of political reasons, be able to do this in Pakistan as long as we still need Pakistan to deal with Afghanistan. But where does Lashkar-e-Taiba and its other miscreant associates operate? They have an enormous infrastructure all throughout the Middle East, Europe, in Southeast Asia. I would love to hear the Pakistani hollering when we arrest some Lashkar-e-Taiba fellow in Bangkok engaging in document forging or money laundering. Like, what are they going to say? Unhand our Lashkar fellow? Of course they're not going to say that. They're going to suck it up. But there's going to be a signal that we're no longer going to tolerate this nonsense. So I'm going to end it there. Have I talked long enough? Okay. No. I actually like Q&A because I'm. So if you're amenable to doing that, you probably are now very afraid of me after the Jsoc targeting and the rickshaw wallah story. Q&A, any questions? All right. Well, I just got a fabulous email today from my former ISI handler who said, Madam, you must be very angry for being PNG'd. That's why you're stooping to such low levels to defame the Army and the ISI. Quote from the email today.
Yeah. Thank Christine. You're the first genuine ISI agent I've ever met.
ISI agent, you called me?
Questions, yeah.
Yeah. Madam, I appreciate your deep understanding of Pakistan and its society and its army. I just wanted to understand whether Pakistani nuclear weapons, given the destabilization in their society, are they safe in their hands?
Right,
Second,
so, yeah.
I wanted to understand whether India has capability to wipe out Pakistan from its map.
Has what?
Wipe out Pakistan from the map.
That's right. So, I don't know. The first one is actually, if you had asked me that question 6 years ago, I really would have poo-pooed it, to be honest with you. Because from the point of view of undesired proliferation, i.e. someone breaking into Pakistan's facilities, there's facilities, they have physical security, they have personnel security. Their incentives are in alignment with ours. After all, if an Islamist militant can get into a facility and do something nefarious, so could RAW, so could CIA, so-called Mossad. By the way, for me, that's a good day. If there could be a Brahmanic Talmudic Crusader alliance that could break into their facilities, that would be, for me, an awesome Eid present. But the fact is, they're very clever. So when those things are in the barracks, that's not where I am concerned, because their incentives are very much in alignment about undesired proliferation. But I'm stressing this adjective undesired for two reasons. One, when they did proliferate to Iran, they did so strategically. And they did so to undermine U.S. strategic interests in the region. This was done, by the way, under that liberal Benazir Bhutto, who also brought us Pakistan official support for the Taliban. So, that martyr to democracy, Shaching Shabash. So they did this deliberately. So when we're looking at the current dynamics with Iran, what are some of the precipitants that might make Pakistan proliferate strategically again? Obviously, Iran comes up. We know about the questions surrounding the Pakistan-Saudi alliance. So you cannot rule out strategic decisions to proliferate. Let me go to the part where I think you're getting at. The problem is that Pakistan, I think India probably does this too, although I don't know, they are constantly moving their assets around as a part of their denial and deception plan so that if there is an event, Pakistan retains a second strike capability. What happens when those things are moving around? They're vulnerable to theft. And what I have been concerned about in the last several years is the degree to which the Army itself has been rendered vulnerable by infiltration. So most of the nasty things, like the Musharraf attacks, the Corps Commander attacks at the Tarbela facility, which was really quite impressive, that they targeted, the suicide bombers targeted the exact unit when they were precisely dining that were involved in the Lal Masjid crisis. That required a very specific degree of intelligence, not to mention access to the facility. And apparently they got that with fellows who just had the rank of a major. Those people do not get as scrutinized unless they go to the command and staff college in Quetta as they do when they get promoted beyond that. So there's this whole cadre of officers who are not as rigorously scrutinized, yet who have a lot of information. So in recent years, I have become very worried about this. Now, by the way, the Pakistanis know we're worried about this. They know this. They know that when we have games, that this is what we talk about. We're not talking about some guy storming Strategic Plans Directorate. What we're really worried about is something happening in the field. So I am of the belief that we cannot be in a position of being coerced by fear, because that's what they instrumentalize to coerce us to keep writing the checks. The fact is we can't stop a terrorist from getting these weapons. There's no amount of aid we give Pakistan. There's no amount of Jsocs that we have in Islamabad. We cannot prevent that. Neither can you. But what we can do is incentivize Pakistan to be responsible, which we're not doing right now, incidentally. We are allowing them plausible deniability. What we need to do instead of begging and pleading to have a big aid program so we can spy on them is say instead, you know what? You're a responsible nuclear weapon state. We know what your nuclear signature looks like. By the way, that's not entirely a lie because of Iraq, because of Libya. We actually are in Iran, especially Iran, with the inspections. For people that are poo-pooing the Iran stuff, we learned so much about Pakistan's signature from the inspections. So don't just think about Iran. Think about the other positive externalities of what we garnered from those inspections. So we say to Pakistan, look, our doctrine treats states that use nuclear weapons very, very severely. You say you're a nuclear weapon state that's responsible, we're going to hold you responsible if your material ends up in the hands of a miscreant who uses it on anyone. Friend or foe, we are holding you responsible. And by the way, what we do to countries that use nuclear weapons isn't nice. So rather than them allowing this fear to coerce us, we need to divest ourselves of this coercion loop and put the responsibility right back on them. But your second question I can't answer. It's not my business. I wouldn't know.
There's an aspect of what you referred to in your talk of the U.S. aid to Pakistan and its basis is contracting. The numbers are striking. Nearly 70% of U.S. support to Pakistan's defense budget comes from purchases from U.S. Mm-hmm. So this is one way of transfer of government money to private contractors of the U.S.
Absolutely. And that's why we do it.
Yeah, that's what you
right?
do. The power sector, which the U.S. supports heavily into Pakistan, 90% of the power purchases are from the U.S. contractors. Even in aid, where they support the poverty alleviation program, nearly 50% of that money comes by hiring U.S. people into Pakistan. The third one, the last one which I mentioned, is a conjecture from various figures. The first two are facts. I would like to have your reaction on that.
Well, look, I mean, we do what's in our own interest, right? It's called U.S. aid because it aids the United States. No, I mean, it is. I mean, so I'm not one of these. I don't believe that we don't give aid to be a do-gooder. That no state does it. You don't do it. Look at the money you give to Bhutan. That's not because you're a do-gooder. That's because you want Bhutan to be in your pocket. All countries do this. It's called strategic interest. So this is what we do. And so this is also, by the way, this has negative externalities in the U.S. discourse because your average American say, why are we giving so much aid? Because your average American doesn't understand that the majority of that aid gets laundered back into U.S. And it is exactly as you said. It's a way of taking public funds and giving it to Halliburton or whatever these big contractors are. And I worked in Afghanistan. I saw this. I mean, that's a whole other issue. Some poor African American with like this much pot gets picked up, spends a life of the rest of his life in jail because he can't get out of that system, and these fellows embezzle hundreds of millions and they get nothing. So my reaction is, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, with all respect to the speaker who is from my old university, I would like to say that not all of us are experts on India-Pakistan relations. Probably he is. He's asked very detailed questions. Not all of us. I mean, we may be interested in world affairs, international affairs, but not India-Pakistan specifically. We may not even remember the years of the wars. I mean, okay, we do know that Ayub Khan was there. We do know that there was a 71 war. We know that there was when Bangladesh was separated and so on. But we can't really identify details of who was in power when. So, I mean, if you can treat us like, young undergraduates to tell us in about 5 minutes, what is your overview of, first of all, I heard you say that Pakistan is built on the two-nation theory, that the two-nation theory, that without it Pakistan cannot exist. Does it imply that India has to either accept the two-nation theory or live with it? And how would India live with it? Because India is a party to the creation of Pakistan. We have rejected the two-nation theory. How on earth can we coexist with a country which believes in it? How come the US and Canada coexisted for hundreds of years in spite of the civil war and so on and so forth? In other words, how can we settle with Pakistan? It's not how the US can settle with Pakistan. That doesn't interest me at all. I mean, my interest in the US is only peripheral. My interest is how can India deal with a Pakistan and a Bangladesh which were created in 1947 when India itself was created. How do we deal with it? You can tell us in a few simple words. So that's all I want to get your view.
Well, so I was trying to be subtle because I'm in India and it's not my place to tell you what your government should do. So that I was deliberately, I took you up to that precipice, but I didn't leap over. So let me just restate my central proposition and you can make your own conclusions. Pakistan cannot let go of the two-nation theory. Without it, what is the ideological justification for it to exist? If Pakistan were to let that go, how does the army justify the inordinate role that it has not only in running and ruining the country, but also in extracting every resource that it wants from the country?
What is India's position?
Well, I'm good again.
Are we to accept the two-nation theory? Should we speak out
What?
of
Your Muslims were not a party to the two-nation theory. They stayed. They stayed. They stayed in India. They're not a part of it. They rejected the two-nation theory because they stayed. So that's not even relevant. The Muslims in India have nothing to do with Pakistan. They rejected the two-nation theory. Their homes are here. They serve in your government. They serve in your armed forces. They are loyal citizens. So I don't know how that applies. But going to your larger question, Pakistan is the revisionist state. You are not revisionist. Every once in a while, someone may make claims about Gilgit, Baltistan. That's rhetorical. India is a territorially status quo power. You're not taking pungas with Pakistan. You're not trying to snatch. You are not, I mean, there might be covert stuff going on, but you are not, as an instrument of foreign policy, dispatching terrorists to kill innocent people. It's not your job to resolve this shit with, this stuff with Pakistan. So you have really two choices. You can, this is, by the way, I'm not prescribing policy. This is what game theory would suggest. right? Anyone who's done game theory, when you're dealing with an adversary that is in this position, you have two options, right? You can ignore it, right? And you just keep on going, and it will keep killing Indians. It will. Without doubt, more Indians are going to die. More Pakistanis are going to die than Indians. That's a fact. Maybe, how many people died in the Mumbai attack? A couple hundred. But this year alone, how many Pakistanis have been killed? Several thousand. So one option is, as derived from game theory, not telling you what to do, is you ignore the menace. And you keep paying the price, and you ignore it. And you set your eyes on the bigger game, which is your economic growth, which is what allows you to keep ignoring Pakistan. Right? That's kind of what Manmohan Singh did. Right? The other approach to game theory that falls from this analysis is that you figure out a way. Again, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying these are propositions that fall out of this problem set. If I had students write a paper, these are the things that they suggest. You have to pull yourself out of that coercion loop. In other words, call their bluff. So in game theory, you know that game Chicken? Indians are probably too sensible for chicken. But this is where you've got two people. You're basically fighting over titles to the car. And you drive right at each other, and the person that swerves gives up his title to the other. That's called chicken. So the first thing I learned when I was at the University of Chicago studying game theory, how do you win chicken? You throw your steering wheel out the window. Even if I want to swerve, sorry dude, no swerving. Right? So you have to figure out how to throw your steering wheel out the window. We did this, by the way, in the Cold War, right? That's what we did in the Cold War. That's what mutually assured destruction was that under certain circumstances, we have no steering wheel, dudes. You do this, stuff happens. And so this is what is called evolution of doctrine, right? So I'm not going to tell you what to do, but there are logical correlates that come out of my diagnosis of the problem if my diagnosis is correct. But that's for Indians to decide. It's not for me to decide. And I don't think it's not the place of my government to tell Indians what to do either. So that's why I'm being coy. I'm not an Indian. It's not my place.
Your question.
Thank you for your brutally insightful lecture on Pakistan. Indeed, one of the finest I've ever heard.
Thank you.
And now let me lead to a question to you. Some years ago when Musharraf was still in power, in a very small party in Calcutta, in honor of some top-ranking State Department officers, I provocatively told them, the discussion was where Osama bin Laden was hiding, and I provocatively told them I knew where he was. And I told them it's as simple as the following: find out on which floor of his house does Musharraf sleep. If he sleeps on first floor, Osama sleeps on the ground, and if he sleeps on the ground, Musharraf sleeps on the first. The idea was provocatively tell them that you are being very ineffective in your policy. My question to you, in spite of your brutal and insightful understanding about Pakistan, why is the United States still so very ineffective?
Look, I sympathize with you because these are really my tax dollars, right? These are my soldiers being killed in Afghanistan. I mean, to repeat the numbers, we've lost about 2,700 active duty troops. We've lost about 1,500 contractors. Getting those numbers is very hard because there's no requirement to report contractors. Some of you may be surprised to know we have more contractors in Afghanistan than actual troops. So this has been a big privatization of the war, which diminishes accountability for that war. And we've lost about another 1,700 NATO ISAF personnel. And I always want to remind people that we've lost about 50,000 Afghans. Right? So as horrible as our losses have been, the Afghans have suffered immeasurably more. So I take your question very seriously, but I can tell you my experience. I was asked to be a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State some years ago, and I demurred for a number of reasons. One was I thought they were trying to shut me up. Right? It's easier to have someone micturating from within the tent than upon it. So I was very suspicious of Holbrook's intentions, and I had no intentions of shutting up. So I can tell you what I have heard people say on the Hill, for example. Everyone's afraid of that next 9/11 commission. And the reason why I went through that exposition of 1990 was to go to your point. When people say to me, because of 1990, we got 9/11. I said, no. 1990 and the cutoff did not give us 9/11. What gave us 9/11 was that we completely withdrew from Afghanistan and we outsourced our Afghan policy to the Pakistanis. And by the way, the Pakistanis did not come out of this conflict in any other place than where they wanted to be. They wanted to be driving the truck, the Hilux, if you will, of Afghan policy. That's why 9/11 happened. It's not because we cut them off. It's because, quite the opposite, we outsourced to them. Where are we now? Right? We are exactly in that. We are looking for the Pakistanis, to use that hideous expression, to pull our chestnuts out of the fire. So for me, the lesson of 1990 is not the lesson that everyone else draws. That we are, in fact, already putting the Pakistanis back in charge of the Hilux, right? So, but I can tell you, because there is such cultural, historical, and bureaucratic ignorance, certainly on the Hill in Congress, and you have to think, when you think about our Congress, think about your Lok Sabha. No, I'm serious, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean, they represent the people, right? And if you look at our Congress, most of them have never left the country until they get pulled on a congressional delegation. Then they have to get a passport. They represent my people, right? We are not well-traveled people. Our school system is crap. We don't know much of our own history. And yet, that is also one of the most, it's an incredibly powerful body, right? The House is where much of our stuff happens. We hope that sense prevails in the Senate, but a lot of buffoonery happens in the House. And so I've done a number of House testimonies, and I've fielded their questions. I unfortunately have a very gut instinct for the buffoonery that exists there. They go to Congress. I wrote about this in this piece, how the Pakistanis beguile Americans. They'll go in these congressional delegations where the Pakistanis roll out the carpet. They're incredibly hospitable. They do a lot of war tourism. They take them to the border of Afghanistan. Look how terrible our neighbor is. They take them up to FCNA. Look how terrible India is. And then they remind them that they were the most allied ally. And your average American doesn't know, no, they're actually not the most allied ally. They're the most perfidious ally. And so there is a tremendous amount of ignorance in our bureaucracy that I don't think people appreciate. And we're not a unified government, just like India isn't a unified government. Your prime minister can say one thing, but the checks have to be passed in the Lok Sabha, right? And your MOD can say one thing, but your prime minister may have a different. This is true of all governments. We never are unified. So what we are seeing happening in the U.S., there's parts of the U.S. government that sort of sees things as they are, and I interact with those people. I know they exist. I get emails saying, please, we're trying to change things. Just keep writing these stuff. Keep being a pest, right? I know they exist. But it is like trying to turn an aircraft. And the other thing the other thing you have to understand is that our Congress swaps out every 2 years. So there is this constant liability of newness. And that, what I've just given you is just an analysis of the Congress. Think about the Pakistan mission in the country. It's a 1-year tour. By the time they meet all the people that the ISI arranges for them to meet, they're already, waiting for the shippers to come and pack up their stuff, and they're moving off to Colombia. So I appreciate your question because I beat my head up with the exact same question. And I'm not optimistic that my government is really going to change because I look at what are some of the big precipitants that should have just, knocked us aside the head? Well, as you said, the Osama bin Laden raid. That should have, whole Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. What's happening? It's in Abbottabad. And what did we do? Sir, aapko kitna chahiye? So that's why, going to your question, I think that what we need to do is brace ourselves for a Pakistan that's more dangerous, more deadly. And, Indians need to decide for themselves. what the appropriate response is. Is it be confrontational and take yourselves out of that coercion loop? Is it basically ignore them, watch them recede in your rearview mirror as you continue to rise? Or is it something else that India comes up with? But from my point of view, I don't see this changing. I wish I could tell you something differently. The only thing that you can hope for is that as the American taxpayer is increasingly fatigued, that those monies will decline. And they have declined. They absolutely have declined. And so but that's not because of strategy. That's not because we realize that they're a bunch of weasels, right? That's because we're poor and we're sick of paying these bills.
There's a model which says that the West is indulging in Western universalism in its foreign policy. For example, there's a lot of rhetoric whenever the US tries to justify its foreign policy of establishing stable democratic states. Has this affected its approach to Pakistan in any way? Because it might not be a universal application of any sort of model is not really advisable in any case.
Okay, so I agree with you 100%. I'm not going to disagree with you. And what I said, states have national interests. India says the same thing, right? Burma, Israel. I mean, we all do this. We have platitudes that we aspire. Those platitudes are mostly for domestic consumption, right? Your average American doesn't want to believe that we go around invading countries for reasons that have nothing to do with what our president says. So these platitudes, I think, are for domestic purposes only. Going to your point very plainly with respect to Pakistan, nothing belies the hypocrisy of that stated policy more than Pakistan, right? Because Pakistan actually has a history of parliamentary democracy. And I remember, I was an election observer twice in Pakistan. I was an election observer in Afghanistan. And I remember Pakistanis were livid in 2004 because this was the height of our Musharraf love fest. And Pakistanis would say to me, oh my God, you are putting plastic ballot boxes on the backs of donkeys and inserting them into the remotest corners of Afghanistan in the name of democracy, yet you are suppressing our parliamentary traditions to support this dictator, right? And all I could say to them was, sir, you're right, because it usually was a sir that I was interacting with, because they're usually in uniform. So you're right, 100% right. And the tragedy is that the only hope that there ever is for Pakistan is it is civilian controlled. And the reason why I say that, and I said only hope, and I'm not saying it's a big hope, it's an only hope, is that citizens of Pakistan generally want what everyone else wants, right? They want good educations for their kids. They want their kids to have jobs. They want to live in peace and security. They want to have the same hospitals that the Fauj has, right? They want all of these things. So your only hope is that over time, a civilian-controlled Pakistan normalizes through the market of repeated elections, right? I would say Iran has more practiced electoral traditions than Pakistan does, right? And I mean that seriously. And the reality is that while we have not brought down any Pakistani government, as Pakistanis are wont to say, their dictators have been incredibly lucky because within some time of their coming into power, something important happens. With Ayyub, it was the Korean War. With Zia, obviously, it was the Afghan War. With Musharraf, it was 9/11. So these dudes have been the recipients of a lot of good luck. Because if you look at every time they've come into... Ayyub was different because the whole world was about militaries modernizing third world countries. The world was on this bandwagon. But Carter didn't care for Zia. And by the time Musharraf came in, we sanctioned Pakistan for Musharraf's coup, and Clinton refused to shake his hand. So our instincts, particularly outside of Ayyub, was to punish these dictators. But because of strategic compulsions, we reversed that. So you're right, and the tragedy is that we are genuinely spiting any prospect for strategic benefits for short-term gains. But this goes to my point to the other gentleman's question. Our system is perennially primed to think in 2-year time horizons because of the churn of our Congress. And so I don't think this structurally means that we are not capable of really securing policies that advance a long-term strategic interest. The Chinese do this because the Chinese don't care about democracy, right? But there are very few countries that can basically, the Chinese are just the opposite, right? They'll take any number of hits today to secure a future that they want tomorrow. But no, you're right. You're 100% right. Ek sau feesad sahi.
Christine, here.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You are doing a cost-benefit analysis to Pakistan of the policies that the government follows and the ISI does. Now, my question is, the biggest cost is to the fabric of the society. The entire civil society's fabric has been corrupted and damaged. And that probably is the most enduring damage that one could see. I cannot imagine how a viable, healthy civil society can come out of this in the short or medium term.
It can't.
It cannot. And that probably is the biggest cost that the government, that the state has paid there.
Well, actually, the civilians have paid it.
Civilians.
Yeah, so this is a horrible problem of
But then civilians are the country. I mean.
Well, but not to the Pakistan army, right? Because they're a parasite, right? So the Pakistan army has a really interesting puzzle. It wants to parasitize the body, but not kill it, right? No, it does. And so from its point of view, what does it need? It needs an incessant supply of javans and officers. Unlike India, it has no problem with officer shortages because the economy sucks, right? So they, oddly enough, are beneficiaries of this system that you just spoke about. 2, financially, they care about being able to continue to buy their crap. Because they are so scary, for the reasons that you noted, the IMF and the Americans and everyone else keeps paying. So this is how, I remember seeing a horror story, and I was watching it, and my husband, who's incredibly insightful, he said, "Oh my God, that's Pakistan." And what this horror story was, this guy was a homicidal lunatic, and he was a pharmacist, and he loved mushrooms. So what he would do when a diabetic patient would come in, he would swap their insulin prescription, and then he would break into their house. And as they went into a diabetic coma, he took them into his mushroom forest. And he had this elaborate, where he would drip nutrients into the body that was comatose. And then he would grow mushrooms on its body, which he would harvest and eat. That is Pakistan's army, right? They're parasitizing this body while putting into place these external and internal stabilizers to make sure that this thing is a corpse that can't resist it, but that it will never die, because then the army itself dies. And there's no more accurate way to put it than that. I know that sounds crude, but I mean, they're really growing algae mushrooms on the corpse of this living corpse of the Pakistan society that they keep alive through these external infusions. Anyone eating mushrooms? Any mushroom currywalas out there?
Will Hillary Clinton coming to become the president make a difference?
What? Will Hillary?
Will she be able to make a difference if she were to come there? I keep hearing some noises from her.
She's been the only one. I know that Indians are very suspicious of her. I see it in the media. But actually, it was her idea for the Clinton visit to come to India. Because remember, she came here in 1994. She was the one that had India is the next big thing. That was Hillary. That wasn't Bill. I'm talking about them as if they're like, my neighbors, Hillary and Bill. But no, that was really Hillary Clinton's innovation, not Bill Clinton's innovation. And she's been the only one who has spoke truthfully to Pakistanis. She said to them very clearly, in Pakistan, your country supports terror. She said that, and I was there when she said it. And you know what? The Pakistanis said, crap, she's right. The other thing that she said that Pakistanis had to accept at face value is you can't grow snakes in your backyard only thinking they're going to bite your neighbor. So compare her to Secretary Kerry, who does nothing but appease the Pakistanis. So I have other issues with Secretary Clinton, but now let's also be clear. She was the one that signed that Pakistan was in compliance with Kerry Lugar-Berman security conditionalities when it wasn't, because we were prepping for the bin Laden raid. Having said that, at least publicly, she and President Obama himself was very clear about Pakistan supporting terror. These two have been the most clear in my system. I mean, certainly Bush wasn't. Bush thought Musharraf was the next best thing, next to fried peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And compared to the other contenders, at least on the Pakistan issue, she looks like she's the best. I mean, if one of these Republican candidates, oh dear dog, I'm going to have to move to Mexico or something. I mean, I don't know what I'm going to do if one of those nutters become the president. But she looks to be the most sane right now.
Yeah, your question. Christine, here. So from your talk, I hear you saying Islam and jihad is used as a tool in conflict as opposed to a cause for conflict, and which is quite different from the dominant perspective. So in this context, what do you think about the debate between Bill Maher, Ben Affleck, Reza Aslan, and Sam Harris?
Okay, so I'm only going to talk about this in the context of America.
Of India and Pakistan.
No, of my country.
Okay.
And so I do not believe that any faith should be beyond question, right? I don't think there's any dogma that we shouldn't be allowed to interrogate. But I believe in respectful debate, and I don't believe in maligning anyone of any faith, right? So let's take Charlie Hebdo. I did not support Charlie Hebdo's cartoons. I especially opposed the cartoon where the prophet was on all fours and his genitalia were exposed. And then they said, well, this is just French liberalism, French this. I don't care what it is. Because I looked at all their other cartoons. They may have depicted the Pope in untasteful ways, but they never did the Christian prophet in such a way. There was no other prophet so depicted. And they had recently ousted one of their illustrators for being anti-Semitic, right? So I thought that this was really hypocritical. I also thought that just because they were, okay, no one deserves to die because of free speech. Full stop. People who kill over a cartoon, they're murderers, full stop. But just because people were killed because of those cartoons doesn't make it speech worth valorizing, right? So it didn't deserve to me an award. They didn't deserve to be killed, but it didn't deserve an award. And I also don't understand the point. There was nothing in those cartoons, as far as I was concerned, that was advancing a debate. What debate were they advancing? Now, South Park advances debates, right? South Park talks about the role of religion in our government. It's usually, at the end of the day, coming down to something about our constitutional foundation, separation of church and state. What was Charlie Hebdo doing other saying, go screw you Muslims? For me, and I'm an atheist, by the way. Anyone who knows me, I'm a dog-loving atheist. I say dog willing, dog bless, right? So I have no cat in this fight. I don't even believe in having dogs in fights because I worship dogs. So for me, it's about, does this foster coexistence of mutually exclusive ideologies, or does this foster corrosiveness? Because at the end of the day, for the Abrahamic faith in particular, especially for Muslims and Christians that believe in a heaven and a hell, you can't believe in both, right? You either believe that I'm right and you accept my God and you go to heaven, or you go to hell. I mean, these are orthogonal spaces. So going back to your point, I don't believe that any faith, any religious book should be unquestionable. But we should never harass, intimidate, or in any way make it difficult to live your life according to whatever faith. If you want to worship peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, go ahead. It's not my place to criticize what people believe. But I think in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, we have to protect the rights of all, or we have no rights for anyone. So oddly enough, just to share with you my own personal vexation as an atheist, I will defend anyone's right to believe in any friend. Because when someone doesn't have a right to believe in their god or goddess, my right to be an atheist is eroded. But what I find very frustrating about believers is that they never defend my right to be a non-believer. Right? That's the thing that really pisses me off. It's like, I'll take a bullet for your right to believe in what you believe, but you won't even defend my right to not believe. And I'm not talking about any other country except my own, right? Look at the response to the SCOTUS ruling. To be American is to be a bigoted Christian who flies this flag which is treason and is a symbol of slavery. That's not my America. But the way this religious discourse is shaped up in my country, we've become bifurcated. There's the country who wants to, there's people like me who want my country for everyone, and there's this country of Christian Taliban who tend to be racist, anti-woman, anti-immigration, every appalling thing that I could ever imagine believing in. And the problem is that we're about equally distributed, which means that that's partly why our Congress is divided. Our Congress isn't divided because they're incompetent. Our Congress is divided because they have beliefs about what our country should be that are mutually exclusive. And that is the problem. And the days of Republicans and Democrats working together to get business done, that's no longer electorally rewarded. What's rewarded at the ballot box is extremist positions. And I unfortunately see too many democracies that are experiencing this. And rather than there being any incentive for us to rush to the middle and be accommodating and inclusive, what people are incentivized to do at the ballot box in every democracy I see right now is to be the most extreme voices in their ideology. And I think more than anything, that imperils the foundations of democracy. Full stop. And we need to figure out a way to incentivize people to be at the middle instead of the extremes. And I'm not talking about India. I'm talking about my country alone.
Christine, thanks for a great speech. Yeah. This is apropos to your recent article on War on the Rocks. I know...
Which one? I write for them a lot. Which one?
The false equivalency between India and Pakistan.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I understand that the hospitality and atmospherics are very important, but should chip mugs and kebabs, should that dictate most important, what could be the most important defining relationship of the 21st century? And because of that, and Pakistani Army's adventurism, should we all be having sleepless nights and saying "Mujhe neend na aaye"? And second question: if we take Balachi nationalism or subnationalism or separatism as the benchmark, say 100%, how much would you, what percentage would you give to Saraiki subnationalism and say Sindhi subnationalism? Thank you.
Okay, so your first question, I don't think you realize that there was a lot of sarcasm in that piece. So you go read the footer that says, this author embraces sarcasm liberally. So I don't think you appreciated the full spirit of that. But the point that I was making, which I think is important for Indian bureaucrats, especially diplomats, is to understand that this does matter. It matters that when they go to Pakistan, they are treated well, that there is the appearance of a frank discussion, and the same people who come here have a very different experience. I'm not telling you to do anything differently. I'm not suggesting that. I was very sarcastic and flippant in that piece. But I have been frequently asked by people in the MEA, how does this happen? And I was being very, very blunt. When people go to, in that piece I said, I've heard it so many times, those Pakistanis take our money and kill our troops. They sure are more pleasant than those Indians. I hear it time and time again. So, I honestly was asking a question that's been asked of me many, many times. And so that's, whether you like it or not, I don't like it. I don't like the fact that my government officials can be so easily beguiled by a trip to the frontier where they see a song and dance at the Frontier Corps. I don't like that, but that is the truth. And I know, and I also think there's something to be learned from the Pakistanis, believe it or not. India has an advantage over Pakistan in that it has facts on its side, right? So let's take this issue of Kashmir. I've been going to Kashmir. Look, it's not something it's an internal issue as far as I'm concerned. It's not my business. But I'll tell you as an outsider who's gone there mostly for vacation, is that there's a success story to be told in Kashmir. The first time I went in 1991, it was a war zone. Now it's just a North Indian city with some crime, right? That's a success story. And that's a success story that India doesn't tell because it's so weary of foreigners going to Kashmir, right? So I think there are gains to be had from being proud of these success stories. And that was the spirit in which I wrote that piece. But I have a sarcastic sense of humor, And you should go back and reread it with the appreciation of sarcasm.
Yeah, that young man.
What numbers? Oh, yeah. All right, so look, I will frequently take pungas with ISI wallahs. You know, you want to talk about liberating Kashmir, well, how about liberating Balochistan? Right, that's a punga. The fact is, I don't think it's ever a good precedent to support changing borders through blood. And there are some parallels. They're tenuous parallels, but there are parallels between, let's say Balochistan was forcibly annexed, right, in Junagadh. You really want to go there? You don't want to go there. You just don't want to go there because there are historical parallels. They are faulty parallels, but they are parallels. So I think India can handle covert operations as it needs to. But here's the other thing. You know, I'm actually working on a Balochistan project right now. The Baloch themselves, it's not the Baloch of the 1970s that were unified. And the Pakistan Army has been doing some really interesting things in Balochistan. I wrote a piece about this, and it's actually in my book. Jamaat-e-Islami, under the guise of FIF, the Falah Insaniyat Foundation, has been very active in Balochistan. Also, the ISI has set up Islamist Baloch militias to counter the ethno-nationalist secular Baloch militias. And then the other issue that arises very quickly is still the predominant sensibility of ethno-nationalist Baloch who reject Islamism and their separatist colleagues across the border in Iran who express their nationalism in explicitly Islamist terms. They have more in common with ISIS than not because they're being oppressed on two dimensions. One, they're not Persian, right? They're Baloch. And two, they're Sunni, confronting an explicitly Shia regime. So Balochistan can be a very productive place for pungas, but I don't ever advocate breaking up a country because that sets precedents that are very bad for everyone, and you don't want to go there.
That young man. That young man.
Zooming out a little from our current discussion, many international relations experts point when of the next when the discussion of the next the international circles, the indication is towards the Indo-Pak area and the South China Sea. The conflict between China and Japan over Senkaku Islands and the other parties involved, and the second big conflict is India-Pakistan conflict. How much would this conflict contribute to the next flare-up? I mean, will this be one of the deciding factor of the expected war?
See, I'm actually, I don't quite understand your question because
The Great War.
The Great War. Oh, yeah, well, I mean, I don't really know how to answer that because there's just too many variables. I mean, right? There are just too. I don't know how to answer that question. I am just a South Asianist, so the other dimensions that you mentioned are just not something that I'm competent to answer. So I'm going to take a pass on that. I'm as many questions as y'all want. I'm game.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is fairly specific. The other is general concerning the United States. During the Zia-ul-Haq era, there was this issue of the self-identity of Pakistan, whether it sees itself as a South Asian state or part of the Middle East. And recently, with the Saudi kind of invasion or action in Yemen, the Pakistanis were asked to come and help, and they refused. Does this mean they've made, they do irrational things, Pakistan, but we have to regard them as a rational state. So does this mean they have, or their elite has made a strategic choice, to be a South Asian power and focus on the two-nation theory, giving up this pan-Islamic possible role?
So let me answer your first one, because I have a bad memory and I don't have a pen and paper. The first one is actually Zulfikar began that, not Zia. After the 71 war, Zulfikar was the one that reoriented away from South Asia. And he did this partly as a rent-seeking strategy to get Arab support for a nuclear bomb. And so and of course he also did that because it was part of his Islamic socialism. So I want to make everyone understand that it was Zia who declared Ahmadis to be non-Muslims. He's the one that began outlawing gambling, drinking, and anything fun. And then Zia took it to 11, but Zulfikar, that was a Spinal Tap reference for those of you who are a fan of Spinal Tap, but Zulfikar had it at 8. Going to your question, the Saudi thing is not as straightforward as it appears. So here's actually, if you were looking at the militant discourse on Twitter, which I love the fact that these terrorists can just like tweet all over the place. It's amazing. But I did an analysis of Jamaat al-Dawa's Twitter feed. They actually, in the same way that Jamaat al-Dawa will set up these coalitions of Islamists and militants for specific purposes. And this one they set up for the Pasbene Harmain, the defenders of the Harmain. And they were arguing that what the Saudis were doing was actually defensive jihad. Surprise, surprise. Because the Houthis were actually coming to destroy the Harmain. And Jamaat al-Dawa and all of them, they had all, basically the whole ticket of scoundrels were mobilizing around this. All right, so much hullabaloo was made over the parliamentary decision to not go. What people didn't know is that the Pakistanis were already in Saudi Arabia. They have troops already stationed there. So in some sense, there were multiple games being played. Right? Pakistanis had the fake sense of sovereignty of their government, but everyone also knows that they were there. The other thing is Pakistan has Blackwater-like organizations. So many Pakistanis didn't know that during the crisis in Bahrain, when the Bahrain government was cracking down on Shias, that Pakistani essentially mercenaries were backing up the Bahrain military in that crackdown. So there's more to it. Every once in a while I'll see some soldiers that are allegedly Saudi, like Bilkul Pakistani, like the Mujhe. So I think there's more to it. I think what was happening, the visuals of it, the army really wanted to put Nawaz Sharif in a pickle. So to explaining the Congress, explaining the parliamentary vote, the army wanted to basically clip Nawaz's ties to Saudi Arabia, because their whole game with Nawaz is to basically keep clipping his wings, because he came in with such a mandate and he came in doing things that were very injurious to the army. So my read on that is the army has its cake, right? The Saudis know they're there. Nawaz had to take a public position that was very alienating, and so again the army gets its cake and it gets to eat it too.
Yeah, and the second one was regarding the U.S. institutional system. Is the fact that the second and third, maybe even fourth level of the State Department changes with every administration a factor in the loss of institutional memory?
I don't think there's any question. But I think the real issue, and I wrote about this recently, is that we don't have a South Asian cadre. And what do I mean by that? So we have a Chinese cadre where they do language skills. We have a Japanese cadre, and we have an Arabic cadre. We have no South Asia cadre. And this means that when there is no South Asia cadre, people are not incentivized to stay in the region, right? They're incentivized to be dilettantes. And there are some truly exceptional people who have a lot of in-depth country expertise, but they're not going to be allowed to stay in the region for them to go up, right? For them to get increasingly promoted and to eventually become an ambassador, which is their goal, they have to leave the region. There's no place in the State Department where you can be rewarded and continue to get pay increases without promotion increases, where your sole value is that you are someone out in the field who knows the country. So what we did do in our intelligence service is that we set up basically, because in that system too, the way you get promoted is by being a good manager. But a good analyst is not usually a good manager, right? In fact, managers typically, these are usually orthogonal sets, good managers and good analysts. So we set up a career track for career analysts where they could get the GS-15. Basically, they're in the senior executive service and they get paid, but they're not expected to become managers. We don't have that in the State Department. And so that ultimately is the problem. And so any entrepreneur, any bureaucratic entrepreneur is going to get that. And in posts that are really important, like Pakistan, I'm going to argue, and I want to be very clear, there are exceptions. But because it's a hazard post, and they can't bring their family, and it's 1 year, we're getting the leftovers of the labor market, right? People who get the post of their choosing are going elsewhere. People are not, oh my God, I really want to go to Pakistan. The people that couldn't get the post third, fourth, fifth, oh, it's my seventh choice, crap, I'm going to Pakistan. These are, in many cases, the people that we're getting. And that's part of our structural problem.
Ma'am, the Wahhabi influence funded by the Saudis has been permeating most of the madrasas and the mosques in South Asia and also in other regions. So I would like to know the impact of this in the long term, how that will affect the Indo-Pak relations, and also can there be some sort of a realignment or rethinking in the policies of Pakistan and towards the other countries, especially India and Bangladesh. The secularists are being targeted. There also the influence of Wahhabism is increasing. The second question is regarding the Afghan new president, who is more pro-Pakistan, unlike Karzai, who was more pro-India. And how will that affect the relations in this region, especially with India?
Well, your first question, there's nothing to do about it. I don't know how to, there is no magical bullet. The fact is, it's interesting, it's a human right to go to Hajj and to do Umrah. When I was in Saudi Arabia last year, I talked to people in Treasury. And they said, look, we know these guys are coming here, even people that are supporting terrorist groups, and they're coming here for Hajj and Umrah, which is their right, and they're getting money for nefarious ends. And the Saudis won't do anything about it. So I don't know how to answer your question other than to note the veracity of it. Full stop. Your second question, I've already kind of answered it in a couple of ways. Pakistan's not going to change the way it sees India. It isn't. For any policy-relevant future, it just isn't. And I see in India the same confirmation bias. Well, this general, isn't he okay? Isn't General Sharif better than the last? No, they're cut from the same horrible cookie dough. No, he is no different. It's not possible for him to be different. So I don't know. I've already answered your question. There's nothing you can do about Pakistan. Nothing. You can't shape it. It's not in our toolbox. It's not in yours.
Hi, Dr. Farah. Thank you so much for an interesting talk. I remember when this book released, I was in D.C. at the Hudson Institute. Why I didn't pick it up right then and get it signed, I don't know, but I picked it up a few months later and read it. So my two questions quickly. The first, everybody knows about the news that ex-RAW officer Dalat, he was saying that even RAW has provided weapons and aid, money, and whatever to Kashmiri insurgents. Whether or not that's rhetoric, as you said, do you think that's going to really make a blow to the two-nation theory? Because the K in Pakistan does stand for Kashmir. And second, I remember reading a think tank report out from the German Marshall Fund on a transatlantic partnership to, help Pakistan out. They included information like having track 1, track 2 diplomacy to bring to attention Pakistan's, crisis, such as using non-state actors or just helping them economically by, not sending money to the military, but to the resource-starved police and, strengthening their civil institutions. How do you think that's going to turn out? Thank you.
So, to your first point, this is the thing I think is really funny about Indians. I don't know why you all pay RAW if you don't think it's doing its job, right? I don't get it. So you think they're just sitting around eating chicken or Subzi or whatever? This is what intelligence operations do. This is their job. It's supposed to be covert, right? You're not supposed to be blabbing about it on the news. So to me, it's not a revelation. That's what intelligence agents, they collect intelligence and they do things covertly to shape the security environment to be favorable to their national interests. That's what intelligence agencies do, full stop. And if they're not doing that, you shouldn't be paying them. So I was not terribly stunned by the non-news. So, nor will the Pakistanis, right? The Pakistanis know what's going on. And it doesn't affect their narrative at all. So it's what intelligence agencies do. And anyone who's known or worked with an intelligence agency knows they do this. But your second question is more interesting. Here's the problem. The Pakistan Army, they are driving the truck. Civil society, they're not even in the cab, they're in the back of the Hilux, trying, to not fall out as this thing is going up and down the hills. Police reform is a very interesting one because unlike India in entirety, because there are some really important efforts here to do police reform, but the police in Pakistan have really taken a hit. These guys, just like police here, you saw it during the Mumbai attack, they are terribly underprotected. The police chiefs of the provinces don't even have armored vehicles. That's pretty amazing given that they're, particularly the Punjab and the KPK police chief, are constantly under terrorist threat. The police have actively tried to reform themselves. They were at the forefront of the police reform efforts that fructified in 2002. It was a police-driven thing. And not surprisingly, when the Musharraf 2002 rigged elections brought this stooge parliament into power that would basically rubber stamp his various his extra constitutional activities, they completely hosed police reform. Why did they hose it? Because in South Asia, police are critical to elections, re-elections. They like having the police as their personal chumchas. So in Pakistan, the biggest tragedy is police reform because there's two opponents. One are the civilians who don't want a reformed police cadre. They want to be able to control their promotions and where they're posted. And of course in patronage, this is huge. They want to be able to exercise control over who gets to pay what bribe to be a traffic cop, right? This is huge. It also cuts at the core of civil service reform because you can't really reform their pay scale without going to civil service. And in fact, the entire civil service in Pakistan, I won't make comments about other countries in the neighborhood, is also reliant upon having a judiciary that's underpaid and therefore institutionally corrupt, right? This is how the system works. Corruption has to be institutionalized for these people to be able to make a wage to provide for their family. And the proponents of reform are the police themselves. One opponent is the civilians. The other opponent is the army, right? Because the army wants to be the sole protector. I remember having an argument is probably a nice word, with a bunch of folks in DOD that wanted to do frontier corps training. I said the army is gonna kill this. I'll bet you any amount of scotch of your choice, I'm gonna win. They're gonna kill it. And I told them why. Why would the army want the frontier corps, who are Pashtun, to be competent when that is their third column that they fear, right? Pashtun separatism. In the same way, they don't want a competitive cadre that's seen as protecting the people. So police reform in Pakistan will go up to a point, but it can't go further. And then also the police reform efforts, I've seen them. They're a fiasco. It goes back to my model of contractors, and they all do this. The Germans do it, we do it, the Japanese, everyone goes through contractors, and I've seen this. So basically you'll have some cop that, retired from the force at a medium rank who looks like, he has lived his retirement in a donut shop, and they're talking to officers who are much more senior to them. And and of course, you know how South Asia is vis-a-vis rank. Like, who is this, no mahina ka pet, Launda Lafanga telling us what to do, and he's clueless. And they don't even bother, the same PowerPoint slide for police training in Colombia, and sometimes they'll forget to change the name Colombia to Pakistan. And then they'll give them, I remember some of the training, they'll teach them how to do forensics. Well, how can you teach them to do forensics when there's no basic science? They taught them to do, how do you rope off a crime scene using that crime scene tape? There's no producer of crime scene tape in Pakistan. So, this is also part of the pork politics. Everyone wants to do police reform because most of the European countries and us think this advances civil military. But in fact, we do it very, very terribly. And institutionally, there's a cap. And I would go through very similar assessments of help civil society all you want, but there's another institutional problem with it. When civil society organizations begin taking money from international donors, they become hostage to that donor, right? And the effective CSA, the civil society associations, are those that are member-driven, right? So CSAs that are member-driven respond to their primary constituents, who are the members. When your primary constituent becomes an external donor, they become your constituent. And so you almost poison that pool. So that's a really dangerous double-edged sword.